The train rattled endlessly across the American plains, a metallic groan that echoed through the open sky. Inside the crowded boxcar, Italian prisoners of war sat shoulder to shoulder, their khaki uniforms stained with dust and defeat. Luca Moretti stared through a crack in the wooden boards. Outside stretched an ocean of wheat and wind, fields without fences, skies without gunfire. It didn't look like the land of an enemy. It looked free. He had imagined America as cold, grey and cruel. Instead, it seemed quiet, so quiet that the sound of the train wheels was the only reminder that he was no longer home. The man beside him, Corporal Rossi, muttered something in Italian about the endless horizon. Luca didn't answer. He didn't want to speak. Words had become useless since the surrender in Tunisia. Across from him sat American guards, young men not much older than Luca himself. They watched but did not threaten. One of them, a tall soldier with freckles and a tired face, lit a cigarette and caught Luca's eye. After a moment he offered one through the narrow space between them. Luca hesitated, glancing toward the sergeant at the end of the car. Then he took it. The American struck a match, the brief flare of light revealing a flicker of something unexpected. Understanding. "Name's Tom," the guard said quietly. Luca pointed to himself. "Luca." Tom nodded once, then looked back at the rolling plains. No more words were needed. Hours later, the sun dipped below the horizon, setting the fields ablaze in gold and amber. Luca pressed his forehead against the wood, feeling the train's rhythm in his bones. He thought of his mother's kitchen in Naples, the smell of bread, the sound of his younger brother singing near the window. War had taken all that. But here, in this foreign land, something unfamiliar stirred, a question he couldn't yet name. The train slowed. A voice shouted orders in English. The prisoners shifted, standing, ready to face whatever waited beyond those iron wheels. And none of them knew that this land, their enemy's land, would soon feel more like home than Italy ever had. Before we discover how one simple dinner would change their hearts forever, make sure you're part of this journey. Subscribe, and let's step back into 1944 together. The train finally screeched to a halt at a place that smelled of earth and pine. When the doors slid open, blinding daylight poured in. Luca Moretti blinked, lifting a hand to shield his eyes. Beyond the platform stretched a cluster of wooden barracks surrounded by fences and guard towers. A faded sign read, "Camp Douglas, Wisconsin." The prisoners stepped down, thin and silent, boots crunching on gravel. They were counted, searched, and lined up in front of American officers. Luca studied their faces, stern, disciplined, yet without cruelty. One officer barked orders, but his tone lacked the hatred Luca expected. It was duty, not vengeance. The camp itself was cleaner than Luca imagined. Rows of low huts, laundry lines fluttering in the wind, smoke curling from a distant kitchen. A field stretched out behind the compound where other prisoners were already working, cutting wood, mending fences, carrying crates. The routine of captivity had its own rhythm, dull but strangely human. Days turned into a pattern, roll call at sunrise, work assignments posted on a board, meals of beans and bread, plain but enough to keep hunger away. Some men played cards with scraps of paper. Others wrote letters that would never leave the camp. Luca mostly kept to himself, mending boots for guards who paid him with coffee or tobacco. One afternoon, as he scrubbed his hands near a water pump, a familiar voice called out in broken Italian. "Buongiorno, friend." It was Tom, the freckled guard from the train. He leaned on his rifle casually, offering a half smile. "You remember me?" Tom asked. Luca nodded. "Train. Cigarette." Tom chuckled. "That's right." He looked around before adding, "You fix things?" Luca shrugged. "A little. Machines, shoes, whatever works." "Good," Tom said. "My family's farm could use men like that. Harvest's heavy this season." Luca didn't know what to say. The idea of leaving the camp even under guard felt both terrifying and hopeful. That night, he lay awake listening to the soft hum of crickets beyond the fence. For the first time since his capture, he felt something close to curiosity. What did an American farm look like? Did it smell like Italy's fields after rain? He didn't know yet that soon he would find out, and that the world outside those fences would change everything he thought he understood. The next morning, a cold wind swept through Camp Douglas. Luca stood in line as names were called for outside work duty. When his came, he felt a nervous jolt. Tom, the young guard, approached with a clipboard and a faint smile. "You're coming with us, Moretti. Farm work, nothing dangerous." Luca nodded, unsure whether to feel relieved or afraid. They rode in an open truck along dirt roads lined with oak trees and cornfields that stretched farther than he could see. The air smelled of soil, rain, and distant smoke. To men who had known only war for years, the quiet of rural America felt almost sacred. No bombs, no alarms, just the wind and the hum of the engine. After an hour, the truck stopped beside a modest farmhouse. A tall man in overalls waited by the gate, Henry Miller. His hands were large and weathered, his eyes cautious but not unkind. Beside him stood his wife, Martha, her apron dusted with flour. On the porch behind them, a young woman watched silently, her hair tied back with a ribbon. "Morning," Henry said to the guards. "We'll need them in the south field. Corn's thick this year." Tom nodded. "They'll behave. You have my word." Henry's gaze shifted to the prisoners. Luca avoided his eyes but noticed the man's hesitation. He wasn't sure how to treat them. Enemies or helpers? The men were handed shovels and led into the fields. The soil was rich and soft under their boots. The sun climbed higher, warming their backs as they worked in rows. Luca found the rhythm comforting, almost peaceful. For the first time in years, his hands were doing something that created instead of destroyed. From the porch, Martha watched quietly, holding a jug of water. She hesitated before setting it on the fence, close enough for the prisoners to see. Luca caught her gesture and raised his hand slightly in thanks. She didn't respond, but her eyes softened. Later, when the truck took them back to camp, Luca looked over his shoulder. The Millers stood by their porch, the young woman still watching as the dust rose behind the departing truck. He didn't know her name, but her gaze lingered like sunlight through fog. That night, as the gates closed behind them, Luca realized something had shifted. The world beyond the fence no longer felt forbidden. It felt alive. The days that followed settled into a quiet rhythm. Each morning, the same truck arrived to take the Italians to the Miller farm. Luca had grown used to the hum of its engine, the chill of dawn air against his face, and the smell of freshly turned soil that seemed to carry both life and memory. Henry Miller directed them with firm, practical gestures. He spoke little, pointing toward the fields or showing how to tie a bundle of corn stalks. The men followed his lead without resistance. War had stripped them of pride. Work was a kind of dignity they could still claim. Martha Miller kept her distance at first. She watched from the kitchen window, her hands busy kneading bread. She wasn't sure what to think of these men. Uniforms or not, they were still soldiers. But as the mornings passed, she began to notice small things, how Luca straightened the rows when no one watched, how one of the men carefully moved a bird's nest from a pile of cut stalks before burning it. They weren't monsters. They were tired men trying to be useful. One hot afternoon, she placed a wooden bucket of water by the fence. No words, no eye contact. When the prisoners noticed, they hesitated before approaching. Luca was the first to take a drink, his hands shaking slightly. He nodded toward the farmhouse and said quietly, "Grazie." Martha heard him, though she didn't understand the word. She only knew it was said with respect. Henry noticed her gesture that evening as they sat at the table. "You don't have to do that," he said, his tone more cautious than angry. "They're working hard," Martha replied, "harder than some folks from town." Henry didn't answer. He just stared at his plate for a moment before muttering, "They're still prisoners." She looked up. "Maybe. But they're still men." The next morning, as the truck approached, Henry left an extra jug of water near the barn. He didn't mention it, and neither did the men, but Luca saw. Small acts like these began to carve something invisible into the soil: trust. As the sun dipped low behind the fields, the prisoners climbed back into the truck, silent but changed. Luca glanced once more at the farmhouse. For the first time he felt a strange pull, not of fear or duty but belonging. The morning began with the low growl of machinery. Henry Miller stood near the barn, frowning at his old tractor that had coughed once and died in the middle of the field. He kicked the tire in frustration, muttering under his breath. The harvest couldn't wait, and every hour lost meant crops left to rot. The prisoners were unloading tools nearby when the sound of silence caught Luca's attention. He turned toward the field, wiping sweat from his forehead, and saw Henry bent over the engine, cursing softly. Luca hesitated, looking at Tom, who gave a small shrug as if to say, "Go on, see what you can do." Luca approached slowly, hands raised in a gesture of peace. "May I look?" he asked in broken English. Henry straightened, skeptical. "You know engines?" Luca nodded. "Mechanic, before war." For a moment, Henry seemed ready to refuse. Then he stepped aside, crossing his arms. "All right, but don't break it worse than it already is." Luca leaned over the machine, studying its worn metal parts. The air smelled of oil and dust. He asked for a wrench, miming the shape with his hands. Henry passed it to him without a word. Minutes turned into an hour. The other prisoners worked quietly, glancing over now and then. Martha watched from the porch, wiping her hands on her apron, curiosity overtaking caution. At last, Luca twisted one final bolt and pulled a piece of wire free. He looked up at Henry and motioned toward the ignition. "Try." Henry climbed into the seat and turned the key. The engine coughed, sputtered, then roared to life. A cloud of grey smoke rose into the bright sky. Henry laughed, a short, surprise sound that broke through his usual reserve. "Well, I'll be damned," he said. "You actually fixed it." Luca smiled faintly, stepping back. "Old engine." "Just tired." Henry looked at him for a long moment before extending his hand. Luca hesitated, then shook it. The handshake was firm, silent, and heavier with meaning than either man expected. That evening, when the truck returned to camp, Luca sat quietly, the smell of grease still on his hands. The day had left him exhausted but proud. For the first time since his capture, he had felt useful again, seen not as an enemy but as a man who could build instead of destroy. The next morning arrived heavy with fog. Dew clung to the stalks of corn, and the air smelled faintly of rain. Luca stepped off the truck, the ache of yesterday's work still deep in his muscles. As he glanced toward the barn, he saw the tractor standing where he'd left it, quiet but alive. Henry was already there, checking the oil, his movements slower, more deliberate than before. When Henry noticed Luca watching, he gave a short nod. "Run smooth now," he said. "Good job." Luca smiled faintly, unsure if he was allowed to answer. "Glad it works," he murmured, the words thick with his accent. Martha appeared from the house carrying a small metal pot and several cups. She walked toward the fence where the prisoners were gathering their tools. For a moment she hesitated, as if questioning her own decision. Then she placed the cups on the wooden post and poured steaming coffee into each one. The smell drifted across the morning air, dark, rich, and warm. The men froze. They had been given water before, but never this. One of them looked at Luca, unsure. He stepped forward first, his voice low. "For us?" Martha nodded, avoiding his eyes. "It's cold out," she said simply. Luca reached for the cup with both hands. "Thank you," he said softly, the words almost reverent. Martha gave a brief smile before walking back toward the house, her apron fluttering behind her. The prisoners drank in silence. The heat of the coffee spread through Luca's chest, mixing with a feeling he hadn't known in months, comfort. He looked toward the farmhouse, where Martha had returned to her kitchen window. Their eyes met for a brief second. She turned away quickly, but the moment stayed. Later, while the men loaded corn into wooden crates, Henry joined them, his tone less guarded than before. "You folks did good work," he said. "We'll be ahead of schedule if this keeps up." Luca nodded, glancing toward the horizon where sunlight broke through the fog. He didn't answer, but inside something shifted. The fence between them and the Millers still stood, yet it felt different now. Less like a wall, more like a boundary. Both sides had agreed not to cross, but quietly understood. As the day ended, Luca carried that warmth with him. It wasn't just coffee. It was dignity served in a tin cup. Sunday morning arrived with a gentle chill that crept through the open fields. The Millers prepared for church, their wagon wheels crunching over the dirt road that led to the small town nearby. From where he worked near the fence, Luca heard the distant sound of church bells. The melody was faint, but unmistakable, solemn, steady, familiar. It carried him far away, back to Naples, where bells once echoed over crowded streets, and his mother's voice had called him to Mass. He stopped working for a moment, eyes fixed on the sky. For weeks he had labored without thought of home, but now a deep ache filled his chest. He whispered a quiet prayer in Italian, words meant for no one but God and memory. Grace Miller, standing on the porch, noticed him. The young woman tilted her head, curious. She had seen him before, quiet and reserved, always respectful. Something about his expression now, sad but peaceful, stirred something inside her. Later that afternoon, as the Millers returned from church, the topic came up at their dinner table. "I saw one of them listening to the bells," Grace said softly. "The dark-haired one, he looked homesick." Henry was slicing bread, his knife steady. "They should be," he said. "They fought against us." Martha looked up. "He's still someone's son, Henry." Grace hesitated, then added, "Maybe we could invite them for Sunday dinner next week, just a few of them." The room fell silent. Henry set the knife down slowly. "Grace, you don't invite prisoners to dinner. Folks in town would think we've lost our minds. But they're not dangerous," she insisted. "They work hard. You said yourself they fixed the tractor, helped with the fields. It might be decent." Martha's eyes met her daughter's. She saw kindness there, the same kind her own mother had once taught her to value even in hard times. "Henry," she said carefully, "maybe she's right. Maybe it's time we did something decent." He leaned back in his chair, sighing. "If the guards approve it, fine. But just once, and only the ones who can be trusted." Grace smiled faintly, hope lighting her face. Outside, the church bells had stopped ringing, but their echo lingered in the cool evening air, a sound of peace that neither side yet understood, but both longed to hear again. The following morning the camp stirred earlier than usual. A faint mist clung to the ground, softening the sharp lines of the barbed wire. Luca stood in roll call, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. The guards' voices echoed down the rows, followed by the shuffle of boots and the rustle of paper as work assignments were read aloud. He expected another day in the fields, the same quiet rhythm that had come to define his captivity. Instead, Tom appeared with a clipboard and an expression Luca couldn't read. "Moretti," Tom called, his tone steady. "You, Rossi and Bianchi, step forward." Luca exchanged a glance with his comrades before obeying. Tom lowered his voice. "There's been a request. From the Millers." Luca frowned. "The farm family?" Tom nodded. "They've asked permission to host a few of you for Sunday dinner." The major approved it under supervision. The words didn't make sense at first. Dinner? With Americans? It sounded like a mistake. Or a test. "Why?" Luca asked cautiously. Tom shrugged. "Guess they figured you've earned a meal that doesn't taste like tin." His voice softened. "You fixed that tractor, that meant something to them." Back in the barracks, the news spread quickly. Some laughed, calling it a trick. Others whispered prayers, uncertain if this strange invitation was mercy or mockery. Luca sat on his bunk, staring at his hands, the faint smell of engine grease still clinging to his skin. For months, those hands had built fences, lifted crates, carried someone else's harvest. Now they were being invited to hold a fork at an American table. On Saturday, Tom found him again near the tool shed. "You'll need to look decent," he said, tossing a clean shirt folded in his arm. Martha Miller insisted. Luca accepted it with quiet disbelief. "She is kind," he said. Tom smiled. "Yeah, she is. Don't make me regret this, all right?" That night, Luca couldn't sleep. He thought of his mother's Sunday dinners in Naples, the clatter of dishes, the smell of sauce simmering for hours, the laughter echoing through narrow streets. For the first time since the war began, He wondered if a meal could still feel sacred. He didn't know what awaited him at that farmhouse, but something inside whispered that this invitation was more than kindness. It was the start of forgiveness. Sunday came with the scent of rain and the hum of cicadas. The truck that carried the three Italians rolled slowly down the dirt road toward the Miller farm. Luca sat in silence, his palms damp, the rhythm of the engine pounding like a heartbeat. He had faced battles, air raids, and hunger, yet this, an invitation to dinner, felt stranger than all of it. When they arrived, the fields shimmered under the soft light of noon. Henry stood near the porch, his sleeves rolled up, posture firm. Martha waited by the doorway, holding a dish towel in her hands, her face calm but alert. Grace peeked through the screen door, nervous and excited. "Afternoon," Henry said to the guards. "You can leave them here. I'll see they behave." Tom nodded. "They will." He gave Luca a quick look of reassurance before stepping back toward the truck. Inside the farmhouse, the smell of roasted chicken and warm cornbread filled the air. The Italians removed their caps, uncertain where to stand. Luca whispered, "It smells like home." Martha motioned gently toward the table. "Please, sit." They obeyed, slow and awkward. The wooden chairs creaked beneath them. Grace set down plates and glasses, her hands trembling slightly. The silence was thick, but not hostile, just fragile, like something new being tested. Henry bowed his head. "We'll say grace," he said. The prisoners followed his lead, unsure of the words, but understanding the gesture. When the family murmured, "Amen," Luca repeated softly. "Amen," his voice quiet but sure. As they began to eat, the air eased. Grace offered Luca a dish of potatoes, and he smiled, fumbling for the right word. "Thank you." She nodded, blushing faintly. Rossi, seated beside him, whispered in Italian, "They eat like we do, family style." "Family," Luca repeated, tasting the word in English. Martha noticed the effort and smiled warmly. "You're learning fast." For the first time, laughter slipped through the tension. It was small, hesitant, but it was real. The clinking of utensils and the soft murmur of voices replaced the old silence. As the meal went on, Luca felt a strange lightness grow inside him. War had taken many things: home, pride, certainty. But sitting at that table, surrounded by people who should have been his enemies, he realized something simple and disarming. Kindness spoke louder than flags. The plates were half empty, and the warmth of the meal had softened the room. Outside, the afternoon light spilled through the windows, painting everything gold. The Millers and the Italian soldiers sat together, no longer strangers, just people sharing food and breath in the same quiet space. Henry leaned back in his chair, studying the men across the table. "You all got family back home?" he asked, his voice even. Rossi nodded first. "Wife? 2 children? Near Rome." Henry gave a slow nod, then looked at Luca. "And you?" Luca hesitated, his fork resting on the edge of his plate. "Mother," he said softly, "and my brother. He fights still. I don't know where." His words were halting but sincere. Martha's eyes softened. "That must be hard," she said, not knowing. Luca looked up. "War takes everything. But sometimes it gives strange things back." He gestured gently toward the table. "Like this." Henry said nothing for a moment, his jaw tight. Then he exhaled. "My brother's in the Pacific. Haven't heard from him in months." The room went still. The unspoken weight of that admission hung between them. Martha reached across the table, touching her husband's arm lightly. Grace's gaze dropped to her plate. The prisoners bowed their heads, understanding the kind of silence that comes from waiting for news that may never come. Finally, Henry looked at Luca again. "Guess we're not that different, huh?" Luca met his eyes. "Only uniforms different." For a moment, time seemed to pause. Then Henry gave a faint, reluctant smile, the kind that feels like the beginning of peace. "You speak more truth than most politicians," he said. The conversation turned gentler after that. Martha poured more coffee, and Grace, encouraged by her mother's calm, tried to teach the Italians a few English words. They repeated them clumsily, laughter breaking the formality that had hung over the afternoon. When the meal finally ended, no one hurried to leave. Luca leaned back, his heart heavier and lighter all at once. The house felt alive, filled with voices that spoke of loss, hope, and something deeper, a shared humanity that neither side had expected to find. As the sun lowered over the fields, he realized that the invisible wall between them had begun to crumble, not with force or politics, but with bread, conversation, and grace. The sun had slipped beneath the horizon by the time the dishes were cleared. A soft hush fell over the farmhouse, broken only by the distant chirp of crickets. Grace lingered near the living room, fingers trailing along the edge of an old wooden cabinet. From its drawer she pulled out her father's mandolin, dusty, silent but whole. She turned to the room. "Does anyone play?" she asked, lifting the instrument gently. Luca looked up from his chair, his eyes narrowed with quiet recognition. "Yes," he said, pointing to himself. "In Naples, before—" He trailed off, but the sentence didn't need to finish. Grace handed him the mandolin with care, her fingers brushing his just briefly. Luca took it with reverence, as though it were a fragile thing from another lifetime. He tested the strings, tuning them slowly. Each note floated into the room like memory. The first chords he played were soft, hesitant, then stronger, more confident. It was an old Neapolitan song, one his mother used to hum while hanging laundry above their narrow alley. The melody rose, filled the house, and reached out into the stillness of the night. Martha stood quietly in the doorway, one hand at her chest. Henry sat motionless at the table, his eyes shadowed with something unspoken. Even the other two Italians, Rossi and Bianchi, seemed to forget they were soldiers. When the final note faded, the room didn't clap or cheer. It just breathed. "That was beautiful," Grace said softly. "Song of home," Luca replied, his voice barely above a whisper. Henry looked at him for a long time. "You miss it?" Luca nodded. "Every day. But tonight, this," he gestured around the room, "felt like home, too." There was no reply, only silence, deep and sacred. Outside, one of the guards leaned against the truck, listening. He didn't speak Italian, but the music had said more than words ever could. Back inside, Luca handed the mandolin back to Grace, and she smiled. As they prepared to leave, no one rushed. The night had given them something rare, peace not forced by orders or signed papers, but born of shared moments of music and memory and a brief understanding between once divided lives. And though no one said it aloud, everyone in that room knew something had changed. The night air was cool by the time the guards signaled it was time to leave. The Italians rose slowly from their chairs, reluctant to return to the reality that waited beyond the porch. Luca stood last, his hand resting briefly on the back of the wooden chair, as if anchoring himself to the moment. Martha came forward with a small basket. "For the road," she said, offering bread wrapped in cloth. "It's not much, but it's warm." Luca accepted it with both hands. "Grazie," he said, his voice thick. Henry reached out with surprising ease and shook each man's hand. When he got to Luca, he paused. "You worked hard. You respected our home. That means something." Luca held his gaze. "Your kindness, it changed us." Martha stepped closer. She hesitated for just a second, then pulled Luca gently into a hug. It was brief, almost instinctual, but enough to break something deep. His breath caught. He hadn't been touched like that since he'd left Italy. He blinked rapidly and stepped back. Rossi wiped his eyes and turned away. Even Bianchi, usually the most stoic, looked down to hide the shimmer in his gaze. Grace stood near the door, arms crossed tightly, as if holding back emotion. "You'll come again?" she asked. Luca offered a small smile. "If allowed." "I would like that." As the men stepped off the porch, the guards fell in behind them, quiet and respectful. The truck engine turned over, its low rumble filling the silence. From the back of the truck, Luca looked over his shoulder. The Millers stood in the glow of the porch light, Henry with one hand on his wife's back, Grace waving once. It looked for a moment like a family seeing someone off at a train station. When the truck pulled away, no one spoke. The road back to camp was lined with trees, shadows stretching long in the moonlight. Luca clutched the basket in his lap. The warmth had faded, but its meaning had not. He whispered something in Italian. Rossi leaned closer. "What did you say?" "Strangers," Luca replied. They cried for strangers. And in that truth something unspoken settled in their hearts. What war had broken, one family's table had begun to mend. Back at Camp Douglas, the routine resumed. Roll call, work details, the sound of boots on gravel, and the crackle of distant radios whispering war news that no one believed anymore. But something had changed in Luca. He sat alone that evening on a wooden bench near the barracks, pen in hand, a single sheet of paper resting on his knee. The light was fading fast, but he wrote slowly, carefully, as if the words themselves held weight. "Mamma," he began in Italian, "I don't know if this letter will ever reach you, but I must tell you what happened." He described the Millers, the warmth of the kitchen, the softness of Martha's hands, the strength in Henry's quiet gaze. He told her about Grace and the way her eyes lit up when someone smiled. He wrote about the meal, not the food, but the feeling of being seen, not as a prisoner or a soldier, but as a man. They fed us. They prayed with us. They listened when we spoke. They cried when we left. His handwriting trembled slightly as he continued. "They are Americans, Mama, but they reminded me of us." Nearby, Tom walked past on his patrol. He paused when he saw Luca writing and stepped closer. "Letter to home?" Luca nodded. "Yes, I do not know if she is alive." Tom's face softened. "Want me to try and send it for you?" Luca looked up, surprised. "You can do that?" "I can try," Tom said. "No promises. But some letters get through." Luca folded the page with care and handed it to him. "Thank you." Tom took it, slipping it into his coat pocket. "You write like a poet." Luca gave a faint smile. "No, just a son." As Tom walked away, the sky turned to indigo. Stars began to appear, faint and flickering. Luca remained on the bench, his hands now empty, but his heart strangely full. That letter was not just for his mother, it was for himself, a way to remember that even in captivity, even in a strange land, moments of grace could still be real. And with a single piece of paper, a bridge had begun to form between war and peace, between strangers and family, between what had been lost and what could still be found. The war ended on a grey morning with no fanfare. No trumpet calls or roaring celebrations, just a quiet announcement over the camp loudspeaker. Germany had surrendered. Italy, already broken and divided, was free. Luca stood among the others as the words echoed in the cold air. Some men wept, others stared blankly, unsure what freedom even meant anymore. Tom approached the barracks later that day with a slip of paper in his hand. "You're being processed for release," he said. "You'll go home soon." Luca nodded slowly. "Home," he repeated, as if tasting the word for the first time in years. The following week, trucks lined up outside the camp. The Italians were given new shirts, rationed bread, and thin travel documents stamped with military ink. Luca held his bundle tightly, eyes scanning the fields one last time. Tom found him near the gate. The Millers asked if they could come say goodbye. Command said no. Luca's face fell, but he nodded. "Tell them. I remember everything." Tom reached into his coat and handed over a small package. Wrapped in brown paper was the mandolin. "Grace said it belonged to you now." Luca's throat tightened. He tried to speak, but couldn't. Instead, he placed his hand over his heart and bowed his head. Later, as the truck rumbled past the Miller farm, Luca saw them. The family stood by the fence, Henry with his arm around Martha, Grace holding a small bouquet of wildflowers. They didn't wave, just watched, their presence enough. Luca pressed his fingers to the glass, wishing the truck would stop, that time would slow. But the wheels kept turning. When the farm was just a dot behind them, Rossi leaned over. "You okay?" Luca nodded. "I think so. But I left a part of myself there." What part? The part that learned how to forgive. They rode in silence for miles, fields blurred by, towns flickered past. But Luca's thoughts stayed on the porch of a farmhouse where enemies became hosts, where kindness wore an apron, and where a girl with a soft voice handed him a mandolin and called him by name. He was going home, but he knew deep down he would never forget the land that had welcomed him not as a soldier, but as a man. Years passed. Seasons turned. The war faded into stories told in front of fireplaces and passed down like old tools from father to son. But for Henry Miller, one memory never blurred. It was a late summer afternoon when the letter arrived. The envelope was worn from travel, postmarked from Italy. Martha brought it in with the evening mail, her hands trembling slightly. Henry sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Luca had once sat. He opened the letter slowly, unfolding the paper with the care of someone handling something sacred. "Dear Mr. Miller," it began, "I hope this finds you well. I am writing not from Naples, but from the hills of Tuscany, where I now live with my wife and our baby son." Luca's words were steady, written in a firm hand. He described a small vineyard he had started, land inherited from a distant uncle, rows of grapes that reminded him of the Midwest fields. "We named the vineyard Fattoria Miller, not just for you, but for your family, for what you gave us, dignity, kindness, peace." He spoke of the mandolin, now displayed in their home, and of the letter Tom had somehow managed to deliver to his mother before her passing. "My boy will grow up learning not only the songs of Italy, but the story of a Sunday dinner in America, a dinner that reminded his father what it meant to be human again." Henry's hand paused over the final lines. "I will never forget the way your wife hugged me, or the way your daughter smiled when I said thank you in her language. I left your country as a free man, but I carried your family in my heart all the way home." Signed, Luca Moretti. Henry stared out the window for a long moment. The vineyard in Tuscany seemed a world away, yet somehow closer than ever. He called out to Grace, now older, with a daughter of her own. "Come read this," he said, and as the sun dipped behind the barn, casting long shadows over the fields, the family gathered again around the table. No war, no fences, just memory and peace. If this story touched your heart, remember to subscribe. And don't miss the next one, where kindness once again rewrites history one stranger at a time.